Professor Bradley, a key challenge for COP30 is bridging the gap. So from your perspective in global political economy, what are the primary constraints and what's the solution?
Well, I think there are several gaps, not just one gap. The big gap, the one that everybody talks about, is the gap between the promises, the pledges that governments give for reducing emissions and what actually happens. Because what has actually happened is that the emissions have not come down as fast as governments have promised through the Paris Accord and so on. We all know that, but that is the biggest gap. But there are other gaps, and they relate particularly to resources. So, for instance, there is a big gap between the resources that rich countries have and poorer countries have for making the changes that are needed to deal with climate change. And even within countries, within richer countries, there is a gap because of the finance required to help some regions and some parts of society that may suffer. So what are the solutions? Not easy, not easy solutions. But what I would say is that China has been a leader, a very positive leader in developing alternative energy sources. Um, and in particular, wind power and solar power, major advances in solar power in China, and the rest of the world should be very grateful and acknowledge that. So, one solution is the determination of governments to use technologies to try to bridge those gaps. Governments can't do everything. Businesses and private organizations also can have a major impact too. So they need to be given incentives and encouragements to be also involved. So raising private capital through lowering the cost of capital, for instance, or through other incentives, those will make a big difference. And also, governments need to take seriously the promises they make, and they need to be held to account, which is one reason why COP30 is happening, is to hold governments to account for what they've said.
Professor Bradley, looking beyond COP30, from your viewpoint, how does China's approach to multilateral institutions and agreements influence the overall effectiveness of global climate governance?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that China was a founding member of the United Nations immediately after the Second World War. From 1971, the People's Republic of China held the seats in the United Nations and particularly the very important Security Council. So China has always, for a very long time, for many decades, has been a key part of global governance and global organizations. And China does not withdraw. Sometimes China has to say things that may be difficult for other countries, but that is the nature of international politics. That's how it is. That happens with all countries. China's also been actively involved in other international organizations like the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, been an active part in all of those. And I think it's true that almost any observer must acknowledge that China has been a major contributor towards developing policies and agreements in climate change because China has as much interest as any other country in promoting measures that will help to contain climate change. There will always be tensions over national interests. That's inevitable. But I think it's fair to say that China, through its previous historic example, has shown that it can be a major contributor to global governance, and it should be acknowledged as such. And that's partly because of the fact that China's economic and geopolitical power has clearly grown in last few decades, and therefore China has to be listened to and will be listened to.